Hey, this is the Church Planting Podcast, and I'm Greg Nettle. I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting, where we help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. On this episode of the Church Planting Podcast, we have my good friend, longtime friend, Patrick O'Connell. Patrick is the director of NewThing. It's literally a global multiplication movement. Now, I've had long conversations with Patrick. He's a lot of fun. But the guy knows his stuff about all things multiplication, how to plant new churches. He's a student in the field, and he shares lots of wisdom with us on this episode of the Church Planting Podcast. Well, I'm really excited and honored to have what's for me a very good friend and co-worker in God's kingdom, Patrick O'Connell on the Church Planting Podcast this episode. Patrick, welcome, brother. It's great to have you.
Greg, thanks so much for having me, man. I love you. I appreciate you. Love the work you guys are up to, and I'm humbled that you would invite me into this. So thank you.
Patrick, I was thinking back when I think the depth of our friendship, really started to build was you and I were in Israel together, and we went out to lunch at this little, kind of little coffee shop place over there, and I think we just spent 2 hours just getting to know each other, and it's just so rich. So Patrick, you're leading one of the biggest church multiplication efforts in the world and with NewThing. And I love our partnership and how we can work together. But, what's exciting you right now when it comes to church multiplication?
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate that. And that was the cafe where Jesus was, right? We went to
that was it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. What's exciting me? Wow, there are so many things. Here's the word that comes to mind: collaboration.
Yes.
There is a wind of collaboration. I don't know if I can characterize it as effectively as I'm feeling it, but it feels like when I'm speaking to leaders, whether in the North American context, or even today, I was on a call with a leader from Nepal, or a friend of mine that I was catching up from a recent trip to France. I know that sounds all cool and stuff, but I think it's really important that those of us, especially in the North American context, understand that God's at work in the global church. And I think there's a new renewal around collaboration, the John 17 kind of spirit of we're going to be different, but we're in unity in Christ. And that takes a lot of negotiation and friendship. Collaboration only happens in trust and in deeper friendships, so what we call friends on mission. But that's what's exciting me, brother, is collaboration.
Okay, so collaboration and recognizing that God's obviously at work around the world. Now, in your work around the world, because we think so much in the North American, U.S. specific context. What are you seeing around the world that you go, oh man, if our U.S. church planters who are listening right now, this is something I'm seeing that's really good globally. We've got to bring into our U.S. church planting?
Such a great question, man. Okay, let me answer it this way. I think what the way that I've been thinking about this with our leaders and talking with some of our leadership teams in these various contexts is the balance and the tension between content and community. I think if I had to make if I had to kind of define what do we do really well in the North American context, we produce great content.
Right.
It's helpful and it's good. And I'm not against content, but we tend to lean a little bit heavier in the content side than we do in the community space, which is how do we actually make this work in our city or in our village or in our region, or how do we work together and bless everything that's going on around us? And that is the harder challenge, if you ask me. The other thing is there's a spirit of obedience that the global church tends to have. It's like, okay, we learned it. When do we get started? Not saying that we don't do that in the North American context, but you ask for a differentiation, and that's what comes to mind.
There's a greater urgency of prayer. I think that we recognize,
absolutely.
And some of that is challenging because when you're in a country, especially where persecution is taking place, which is in a lot of our areas that we're all working in, there just is a greater sense of urgency because you're praying that you don't get killed as you start your new church, which is going to create a greater sense of urgency. But there's this fire that, I think back, Patrick, to, man, when I was first starting out and I'm like, man, anything for the gospel and I'll sacrifice it all. And how do you keep that fire lit, or how do you start that fire, ignite that fire in all church planters? Now, as you go out and you're working in a variety of areas, what are the barriers that you're seeing to collaboration right now?
Oh, such a great question, man. You just gave me a softball, brother. So thank you. There's three that I like to talk about. There's probably many more, but these are the three big ones. And I'm just coming off of a trip to France where we got to work with some of our European partners, which is really great. First one is ego. Okay, ego. We have got to figure out this is about the kingdom of God, and this isn't about a brand or a particular denomination or organization. God uses all those things. I love them, but we've got to get our egos out of the way, and we've really got to make sure that we understand that the end game here is the kingdom of God. And when we can rally around, I think our friend Will Plitt at Christ Together talks about, how do we make mission the bishop of our city or our region? And when we can all begin to kind of come around that idea, it does help us deconstruct this ego, which is about building our thing and our platform. I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but it's inevitable, right?
Yeah.
The second one is economics. How do we work out the economic realities of collaboration? And we can talk a good game of collaboration, but if you're a church and you've got a church staff team of 20 people that you love and are doing life with, you don't want to risk certain things economically. That's just a reality. That's okay. But we have to, if we're going to get to a greater sense and overcome the barriers of collaboration, we have to just be honest about the economic realities. And what I love about you, Greg, and Stadia in particular is kind of the focus on bivocational, co-vocational, like opening it up. And we've got to have some rigorous, honest discussions around the economics that prevent us from collaborating together. Because we're all trying to build our castle. It's really hard to build the kingdom of God. And then the third one that I would see, I guess more than often, is the ecclesiological models. So at NewThing, we've really tried to make a point to focus on the principles of movement rather than on the modalities of what you need to do to achieve certain outcomes or certain goals. So, I was in Paris with some leaders. I wouldn't dare tell them the mode of planting a church, but I can certainly help them in the principles that would help them help them plant new churches. And I think we've got to just be honest that these ecclesiological expressions are going to vary if we're going to have to collaborate together. And that's okay. That's okay.
So first of all, I appreciate your preacher, ego, economics, ecclesiology.
You like those? You caught those? Okay.
Yeah. Everybody out there taking notes going, oh, that'll preach. Let's do it. The ego one sounds so basic, Patrick, but I mean, I remember, when I first really got serious about church planting, and it was a 2 a.m. wake up call from God, like the baseball bat to the head in the middle of the night saying, hey, this is not about your kingdom, Greg Nettle. And, because, I'd been working to build the big mega church for years, and there's nothing wrong with the big church, right? We all know that. And, but I was looking at it as my kingdom, not God's. And that's just a confession. It's painful. That was a long time ago. I've already repented of that. So then you have to ask the question, okay, if it's not my kingdom that we're about, what's the most effective way to expand God's kingdom? And we know that's through collaboration. It's amazing what God can do when we don't care who gets the credit. And so that leads you to church multiplication. And how do we come together to collaborate to multiply more and more of God's kingdom expressions? So as easy as that sounds, man, it's like the biggest breaking. Now, what I love, and I wonder if you're seeing this in the next generations. I think I'm seeing less ego and more willingness to collaborate. Is that something that you're watching?
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing that out. I do think, I'm a recent grandfather, which still
congratulations, there, brother.
So my little guy, But I think, Greg, you're onto something there. It feels to me, let me just make an observation. It feels to me that planters that are a little bit younger than me, let's say in their 30s and 40s, are much more willing to use that phrase, bishop the mission of their city versus a loyalty to a particular tribe or organization. Again, those things are good as long as they're submitted to the kingdom cause in the place, in the city, wherever the church planting is happening. And I think you're right to point out there's a certain spirit that maybe younger leaders have to say, you know what? I live in Chicagoland. It's Chicago that my heart burns for. It's the people of Chicago, not my particular tribe or denomination. If it's helpful, that's useful to me. If not, though, it's about the mission in Chicago or in Cleveland or where else.
And so there's also a hunger, I think, for relationships. So and I think that's greater even still, again, in the younger generations. They're like going, I don't want to do this on my own, which, used to be, I'm kind of going to go be this Lone Ranger kind of attitude. The other thing I would say, so Julie and I move into the city of Cleveland. And one of the things is when you're moving into a new area and you're going, man alive, we need a lot of churches in this city. All of a sudden you're just looking for a brother or sister in Christ who's willing to come alongside you to spearhead, a micro church movement or whatever it might be. And you're willing to link arms because you're going, man, it's just dark here. And I don't want to get lost and killed in the midst of this. And I think that's true globally as well, especially in areas of persecution. Let's talk about the economics a little bit because, it's kind of the elephant in the room so often when we're trying to partner together and collaborate. And it's one of the reasons Stadia took money off the table several years ago. And so all church starters get our stuff for free. But man, we still have to fund the mission, right?
Right.
So what are you learning about that? I mean, because, church planners, be it bivocational, co-vocational, launch large, digital, whatever. I mean, they still have to raise some level of funding. Speak some words of wisdom into that.
Yeah, it's great. Your observation of the challenge is right on. Here's where we kind of have shifted our thinking over the last 5 or 6 years at NewThing. So I come from the business background, Greg. Before I got into church planting, I was in portfolio management. So I look at this as like, how could the church create, you're referring to Cleveland, how could we create a portfolio that diversifies the risk of church planting? So when you ask most churches and church planners, or let's say most churches, why don't you plant more churches? They'll say something like this: we need leaders and we need money.
Yeah.
Okay, that's sure, great. But what if you could grab a group of churches who all have assets to bring to the table, some financial, many relational, some spiritual? You begin to emerge as what we call a network, 4 to 6 churches, who then can go to maybe some harder to reach places and plant some new innovative things without taking all the risk on to the local church. And they can also then fundraise around a different dynamic. Instead of just growing one church or one brand, maybe it's like, we're going to reach the 11th Street neighborhood in Chicago, whatever it is. But now you've created a little bit of a different ecclesiology and economic opportunity, and the churches can kind of throw in. I think every church has assets and liabilities. And so if we're thinking about it using that portfolio metaphor, hey, church A has some money, church B has a planter, church C knows this person that's got this space, and as a missional business sense, they'll let the church meet there. You see where this can go. And so I'm more interested in kind of trying to find those innovative opportunities than I am still fundraise, still do all those things. And that's what I feel like God's trying to do right now in some new ways.
Okay, so I think that's a great segue into the ecclesiology because, as you're watching what God's doing in multiplication, what ecclesiological modality are you most excited about right now?
You're such a good interviewer, brother. What am I most interested and excited about? I'd have to say microchurch is really interesting to me. It really is. And I know it is to you as well, because of all the reasons we love, right? It's fluid, it's dynamic, it's resourceful. leverages the priesthood of all believers. We can go on about this. I'm intrigued digitally speaking. I've got kids who are in their 20s. They look at the digital space a lot different than I do as a Gen Xer, and so I want to pay attention to that. I don't know if I have all right, this is what God's doing, but it's really intriguing to me. And then one of the things that we do, Greg, is when leaders are interacting with NewThing, I just ask them to read Romans 16, and maybe some of your listeners could do that. Romans 16 is kind of a boring end of a great theological treatise, but it's Paul just greeting his friends in Rome, and it's his network. And so it's exciting to me that at the end of that letter, when I closed my Bible over Romans 16 and I finished it, Paul is thinking about the mission in Rome a lot different than I was as a church planter when I church planted in Kansas City. And I need to learn from Paul. I need to realize that. And I think there's some new innovative ecclesiology that will come out of that. How we fund it, how do we sustain it? I think that's the season we're in right now.
But it's exciting times. I was just, as I'm sure you have, I just, read Daniel Yang's most recent book, Inalienable, and talking about the church being informed from the edges.
Yeah.
And so the reason where I'm circling back on this is thinking about microchurch, because the reality is there are some really cool things happening with microchurch in the United States. If you're interested in that, contact Patrick or Stadia, and we can get you information on who to get in contact with microchurch expressions. But I think one of the reasons we're so excited about that isn't the United States. It's what God's doing outside the United States. It's crazy what God's doing in India right now. It's unprecedented. In Nepal, where you said you just were, it's unprecedented what's happening in Nepal in the microchurch movement. And so I think when we look at these modalities, and what we're excited about with ecclesiology, I'm going, man, that's just a new expression that, I shouldn't say that. It's an ancient expression, biblical expression that I think we're becoming more aware of now here in the United States to what God's already doing in the rest of the world. Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, brother, you said it exactly right, in my opinion, and this is why it's more important that every one of your listeners and all of us in North America or Europe or India, wherever we are, that we all sit around the round table of mission together as equal partners, as equal in this whole missional identity that we place on ourselves. But I think to your point, Greg, one of the things that it feels like those of us in the North American context are realizing is God's good and he's been faithful to his mission, and the modalities that we have camped out on, maybe you might, the church growth modalities, again, no criticism of that. God's used that. I thank God for the church growth movement. But I think when I'm talking to leaders now, I'm hearing, right, how do we become a more movemental organization? How do we become a more decentralized organization and yet keep the focus on the mission and church planting, etc.? Those are the questions of our time. And those are, as you said, it's a fascinating time if you appreciate that opportunity that I think God's laying before his global church.
And I think that you implied what I'm getting ready to say, and I'm just going to call it out. You were talking about people around the table, and what's implied is what you and I were talking about before we came onto this podcast, this posture of learning that we need to have. Where we go, man, I don't have all the answers. But I love sitting around the table with brothers and sisters from different backgrounds, different ethnicity, cultures, races, global, wherever they live, and just learning from one another, right? Because that's how the church is going to advance.
Yeah, I think, Greg, what I've done is I've taken a personal discipline. And when I look at my calendar for the week, I ask myself, now I have the privilege and the luxury of working with global leaders like you do. But even when I have a calendar full of, let's say, a lot of North American stuff, I'm always asking myself, who else do I need to talk to this week to make sure that I keep a perspective on things? And that's just a personal discipline of mine. Like, I make sure that I'm speaking to a non-North American leader every week, or I'm a different leader from South America, just as you said, and I love your posture. I'm a learner, and maybe guys like us, if nothing else, we're just brokers of what God's doing, and we're exchanging that information around the table, so to speak. So yeah, man, that's my heart.
Okay, you touched on digital.
Yeah.
I think you and I, when you look at the future, the pandemic accelerated in the United States, the whole digital movement, if you will, presence of the church. Um, but man, I tell you, I think about, I have a 14-year-old son and his relational network is on a gaming platform. Man, it just is. And, we do I think in person is, important? Absolutely. But I look at him and I look at the depth of the relationships that he has online. And I just think to myself, man, we've got to be moving forward with digital as well. It's one of those great opportunities of the kingdom. How much do you see technology playing out in the future of multiplication?
Yeah, I think a lot, my friend, to your point. My kids are, my youngest is 19, and how he interacts with technology is just vastly different. And I think it does come down to guys, guys like us and some of your listeners, men and women who might not be familiar with digital, just don't say no to it. Just say yes to it, because I think it is a factor in the future of the church. But I'd be lying to you if I had any specific prognosis. I do think that, and you brought up your son, his emotional and intellectual engagement is the same digitally as you and I might have in a space like when we were in college or something. And we should make a value judgment about that. Those relationships are just as important to your son as anything that I did with my buddies back in the day in business or in the army or whatever. You know what I'm saying? And so I think you're appropriate to call that out. The question is, are we going to let our ego, economics, and ecclesiology get in the way of innovation in the digital space? And so, yes, the answer is an affirmative yes. I'm personally committed to it. My wife and I have had some conversations about what would it look like to start a digital church. Is that, we're not there yet, but we're praying about it. And I also think we need to give each other some grace and some patience as a church, as the church global. Let some innovators innovate and see what God's up to. You know what I'm saying? Let's not say no to it. Let's not block and tackle it. Let's let the new thing, happen.
No, and I appreciate that. And that's why I love the name NewThing. It is a scriptural and, and it's, we gotta let it happen. I think about, okay, how does the church scale, right?
Yeah.
How does it multiply rapidly? And I'm going, man, digital drives the costs down dramatically. It could potentially unleash untold amounts of finances for community transformation, justice, everything you can imagine, because we're not having to pay for buildings and land and different things. And then, what if you could use digital to birth physical expressions of groups of micro churches around the world, right? So I just want to get our listeners excited about this, because I do think that God is doing a new thing, and there's just so much potential, that's out there right now.
And
okay,
let me just affirm you, Greg. I mean this, I'm with you. You're just a tad bit older than me, but we need
have a 14-year-old son, Patrick.
But we need that innovative spirit that you bring to the conversation, that posture of learning and humility. That's what we need to advocate for one another as leaders and church leaders. And let's just see what the Lord's up to and find out. But all those things that you mentioned are exactly right. Those are opportunities.
Okay, we just got a couple more minutes here before we wrap up. Let's talk about, I want to hear, what are you excited about at NewThing right now?
Yeah. Thanks for that, brother. We've been evolving as an organization. There's two things that I'm really excited about. I hope we do a lot of things well, but I hope what we do really, really well is we help churches reproduce at every level, because we know that mission gives life. You want to drive evangelism and discipleship, your church gets on mission and plants churches. They should talk to you. They should talk to any of the other church planting organizations, because mission gives life. When a church is on mission, it's gonna do new things, innovative things. So I'm excited that, to your point, we could do that digitally and micro and global expressions, new expressions that we weren't even contemplating 10 years ago. The other thing that I'm excited about at NewThing is what we call the movement system. We've been working on this through the doldrums of COVID, It's all our stuff in the past, but what we're doing is we're saying, hey, if we can come alongside you and help you start a movement, but here's how it's going to happen. You got to start with discipleship. You got to start raising up leaders. You got to be planting churches. You got to network with other leaders, collaboration, and you got to think about mission in your city differently. And man, that's what excites me about it. The thing that I love about the global church, and I know we share this passion, is I want to learn, listen, and incorporate what the global church is learning is in many places as possible. So those are the things I'm excited about.
I'm right with you, brother. Okay, one last personal question, Patrick. How old were you when you decided to become a follower of Jesus?
32. And Stadia was my first organization that I assessed with. And fortunately for me, you guys didn't say no.
Brother, I am so proud of all that you're doing and that Stadia's been able to be a small part of it. Patrick Connell, thank you so much for your time today, and I'll look forward to next time.
Ditto, brother. Love you much.